The Firm, India's only show on corporate law, tax and audit matters.
So today, let's talk about the idea of India that the Constitution envisages. I'm going to, sort of demarcate this conversation into a couple of different parts. One, I'm going to talk about the time that was partition, a time in the 1940s when the Constitution that had been agitated for, that had been fought for, the Constituent Assembly that had been a core part of the nationalist demand, the Constitution that was being conceived of, what were the 1940s like? Let me take you back to that time. 1946, 47, 48, 49. A little before my time. But a lot of people don't think about the fact that ours, perhaps, is a classic post-conflict constitution. Partition is happening. People are moving. 10 to 12 million people are moving across borders. 1 million people will die. People will be assaulted. People will lose everything that they have. While all of this is happening, Parliament functions as Parliament in the morning and a Constituent Assembly in the afternoon. Imagine today's Parliament being able to do that. So part one will be about the time that was, the 1940s. Part two will be about the Constituent Assembly itself, the 296 members that were to be, and the 210 members that wrote our Constitution. Part three will be two sort of, I think, contemporary issues today that are in the press that, I don't know, some of you may have thought about, appointment of judges and the beef ban, which I know is something that you Bombay dwellers are dealing with. We in Delhi have a more nuanced approach to it. We treat it like narcotic drugs. It's out there. We try to get it. But we're going to talk about the beef ban that has come to be. So these are two contemporary issues. And eventually I'd like to end with two towering personalities, two wonderful, wonderful Indians, two great heroes of mine. A brief end to this conversation with references to Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister, who spent, interestingly, 9 years in prison, and Ambedkar, Dr. Ambedkar, the student who could not get beyond the last row because of caste and grew up and crafted the freedoms that you and I have, grew up and crafted the federal system that is often the most important part of any constitution. Equality, when countries are being founded, is rarely controversial. It is how you share tax money that is most controversial. So the young boy who was not allowed to drink from the common drinking pool, who could not get beyond the last row. So when young people sit in the last row, as many of you have, I say to you this: there was a gentleman who crafted what we have, who fought very hard to get beyond that last row. So we will end the conversation with discussing a few ideas from Nehru and Ambedkar. All right, so let's get started. The time that was, this is a classic image, partition, trains coming in from across the border, trains going across the border. You know the stories, people being displaced, violence, mayhem, an extraordinary time. The movement of people that happens on foot, 10 to 12 million people are quote-unquote displaced. Those were the times that were the late 1940s when this constitution is being crafted. The images were almost always horrific. And that is what makes it so extraordinary that on this side of the border, you had a bunch, mostly men and some women, who came together and decided, never again. Never again will we be separated only on the ground of religion. The unfortunate thing about partition is that, if you travel the world, you will have museums to the genocide. You will have museums to the Holocaust. I have not come across a museum to what has probably been a defining feature, not just for India, but also for Pakistan, for the subcontinent, a museum to partition. And the images of what partition meant to so many people at that time, and what it means today to us as Indians, as we've had a change of government, as we've gone from one political dispensation to another. Religion remains a controversial issue in this country. And secularism, or secularism, as some folks would like to now describe it as, remains also controversial. So what was that time? How did we come to be secular? Some of it is this: never again. That this side of the border would be a secular country. This side of the border would not be defined by religion. It would be defined by a common, mutual sense of citizenship. A citizenship that was not premised on religion. A citizenship that would be premised on the caste system being dismantled. A citizenship which would be premised irrespective of gender. India grants universal adult franchise to all citizens in 1950. Interestingly, Switzerland does so in 1976. So a real core commitment to this conception of equality. Partition, two countries are being formed. Muhammad Ali Jinnah on your right, Jawaharlal Nehru on your left, Lord Mountbatten in between. All of them look distressed, to put it mildly. So Jinnah, of course, is a member of the Bombay Bar, like Gandhi was, like Ambedkar was. So this city is really the bastion for the founding of so much. And the Bombay High Court, unfortunately it's still called Bombay, the Bombay High Court, these were members of that bar. So let's now talk about what is a constitution. Is it a common thing? 800 constitutions have been created since Aristotle's time. Can anyone guess what the average length of existence or endurance of a constitution is, of these 800 since Aristotle's Athenian constitution? Anyone? Nobody. There are 12 lawyers. Anyone? Average guess. Sorry? 200 years. The thing I love about Parmesh is he's always optimistic. It's his core value. Anyone else? About a decade. Close. 800 constitutions, the average endurance is 16 to 19 years. We, ladies and gentlemen, have turned 66. Pretty damn good for a country whose images you saw in the 1940s. 12 million displaced, 1 million killed. Pretty damn good if you're at year 66. So, the point of that statistic was to try to explain to you that for a constitution to endure means many things. It's not just a wonderful thing, it's not just something we take for granted, but it means many things. And if you travel the world and you go to countries which don't have constitutions, South Sudan, Nepal, Pakistan, that has veered from between 3 constitutions, 4 or 5 military coups, parliamentary to presidential forms, and you will know that to have a constitution that endures is a truly special thing. And that question really is, why has India's constitution endured? A country that is divided by so much, how is it that this constitution has endured? So, 1947, Pakistan and India are created a day apart by the same statute, the Indian Independence Act. Partition is the largest migration ever of human beings. That is fact 2. Fact 3, in 1948, we lose both Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, who's assassinated, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who dies of tuberculosis, within 6 months of each other. Both fathers of their nations are dead. The Constitution of India is far from complete, and partition is still playing itself out. Those were the times in which this book was written. The Constituent Assembly had 296 members to start with. the Muslim League then decided not to be part of India's Constituent Assembly. So then we were left with 210 members. And it was a fairly homogeneous body. This is what's interesting about India's constitution. It wasn't a very diverse body. It was a predominantly homogeneous body of, well, upper caste men. Nonetheless, who contemplated and conceived of the dismantling of caste, who contemplated and conceived of universal adult franchise, who contemplated and conceived of equality across gender, who contemplated and conceived that discrimination on any count, religion, caste, gender, or any other ground would be unconstitutional. That is the commitment of this homogeneous body of men. It's unfortunate that the Supreme Court, a marginally more diverse body, didn't quite think so when it was putting out the 377 ruling, and it was okay with that kind of discrimination. But moving along, so composition, if anyone's interested, 155 Hindus, 30 scheduled caste representatives, 5 Sikhs, 5 Christians, 5 representatives of backward caste, 3 Anglo-Indians, 3 Parsis, 4 Muslims. The Constituent Assembly then decided that they would craft and adopt a constitution for the people. And not just the people of their generation. They were quite committed to the idea of crafting an enduring constitution. And this is what Nehru says about it, before I read you an extract of the constitution. He says this: "You all know that this Constituent Assembly is not what many of us wished it to be." The Muslim League has left. "It has come into being under particular conditions, and the British government had a hand in its birth. But you must not ignore the source from which this assembly derives its strength. Governments do not derive their strength from state papers. Governments are, in fact, the expression of the will of the people. We have met today because of the strength of the people behind us. We shall go as far as the people, not of any group or party, but always keep in mind the passions that lie at the heart of the Indian people and try to fulfill them." And this was Nehru moving the resolution of the aims and objectives of the Constituent Assembly. So why is it that India's constitution was effectively drafted in 146 days, within 2 years, whereas 2.5 years, whereas across the border, Pakistan does not get its constitution made till 1961, when a military government comes into power and gets it done. And this is not about this being, oh, well, we did it and they didn't. I mean, this is not a cricket match, right? This is about trying to have a meaningful conversation about why is it that we were successful at getting this together, where if you look across the world, either constituent assemblies are either unsuccessful or the products that they craft don't last very long. So why is it? Is there something that contemporary India's politics can learn from the techniques adopted by that Constituent Assembly? And I believe there is. The Constituent Assembly used 2 techniques, which actually has a lot of resonance, I think, today, when you talk about Parliament being lock-jammed and when you talk about bills not being passed, but let's rule by ordinances. The 2 techniques that India's Constituent Assembly used was, one, that they would pass everything by consensus. So it means that how this room votes, whether 79 people want it one way and 69 people want it another, would not be the way we would adopt a clause. The way we would adopt a clause would be by consensus. We would all talk about it. We would all put forth our differing aspirations, and then we would adopt a clause. An extraordinary act, because it immediately means that consensus-oriented decision-making only works if you trust the person you're sitting next to. Consensus-oriented decision-making only works if you have a Mandela, South Africa gets their constitution done, or if you have a Dr. Ambedkar, or if you have a Sardar Patel, or if you have a Nehru in the body. That's when consensus-oriented constitution-making gets done, right? Second technique, let's try to not locate our sense of identity, of who we are, in either caste or religion or ethnicity. A truly radical idea. Because, of course, in the 1940s, our identity was premised or built around ethnicity or caste or religion, right? So a truly radical idea that we would defer controversial choices built around identity. We would take this idea of a uniform civil code, unfortunately, and put it away in the directive principles section, which are not enforceable. We would not pick, we would have both a national language and an official language, English and Hindi. We would not make that choice. But it also meant that we would not locate our sense of we the people in what we are most familiar with. And in the 1940s, and arguably even now, for many people, what is most familiar may be caste or religion or ethnicity. But that Constituent Assembly was very clear that that would not be, not even a primary identity. It would not be part of what Indian citizenship was meant to be. We would be citizens, we would be colleagues, we would be comrades to each other. And that would be a modern cosmopolitan bond. And that, in its time, was a truly radical idea. So now, let's talk about some of the people in that Constituent Assembly, some of the key members. And I'm going to need a slide. Dr. Ambedkar. I have his picture up in my office, and a few months ago, a client walked into my office, and I've got his picture right behind me. I've got two pictures, actually, where I sit. I've got one, this picture, which is of a youngish Dr. Ambedkar, and the client said, well, is that your grandfather? No, I really like my grandfather. I love my grandfather. I said, yes, he's everyone's grandfather. And my client was like, yeah, whatever. And I have another picture on the right of my desk. It's a great picture. It's Nehru in a go-kart, right? And he's sitting next to what I believe should have been the Dutch Prime Minister, right? So they're both sitting in this go-kart. Except that it's not the Dutch Prime Minister he's sitting next to. It's me. Because for my birthday, you know, my face was superimposed onto the Dutch Prime Minister's. So, one of my colleagues in the office, a young, enthusiastic man, sees this picture, wants to make the boss happy. And he said, Madam, Nehru and Indira? He's going to go far. The intern walks in an hour later, an intern from Mumbai, I might add, and said, ma'am, how old is this picture? When did you meet him? Intern will not go far. I feel we meet the both of them every day, and we don't even realize it. So let's talk about my grandfather and the gentleman I went go-karting with. When conceiving of this idea of equality, role of religion, morals, the Constitution gets racy sometimes because there's all of this morality, public health thing, which I think is very exciting because it could mean so many things. But when all of this was being discussed, Dr. Ambedkar was asked for his opinion on what are we going to do about public health and public morality and so on and so forth. And he said this, and what he said is the premise of the kind of morality that binds you and binds me together. And it is this. Dr. Ambedkar spoke about constitutional morality. Quoting Grote, a historian from Greece, he said this: the diffusion of constitutional morality, not merely among the majority of any community, but throughout the whole, is the indispensable condition of a government at once free and peaceable, since even any powerful and obstinate minority may render the working of a free institution impracticable without being strong enough to conquer ascendancy for themselves. By constitutional morality, Ambedkar said, Grote meant a paramount reverence for the forms of the Constitution, embodying obedience to authority, acting under and within these forms, yet combined with the habit of open speech, of action subject only to definitive legal control, and unrestrained censure of those very authorities as to all their public acts, combined with a perfect confidence in the bosom of every citizen, amidst the bitterness of party contests, that the forms of the Constitution will not be less sacred in the eyes of his opponents than in his own. That you and I can disagree, but we will do so premised on the morality of the Constitution, premised on the fact that we will hold our public institutions accountable, premised on the fact that public institutions would all act within the roadmap of the Constitution, that action that the public institutions would take would be subject to critique by our free speech, that this would be the only morality that the Constitution would countenance. So a morality that disenfranchises, a morality that discriminates, a morality that renders any citizen untouchable or criminal only by virtue of choices or by virtue of historical birth would not be a morality that was countenanced in this country as of 1950, right? Dr. Ambedkar, and I know I'm a little short on time, but now moving on to my go-karting buddy. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru signing the Constitution that was adopted in 1950. He went go-karting after this. And this is what he said. It's, I don't know if you've read a book called The Discovery of India. I'm starting a reading club, so I come here, I give people suggestions of books to read, Constitution, Discovery of India. So I was doing this at a lecture, and someone said, ma'am, what do you think about magazines? Nehru, son of, almost an aristocrat, educated wherever he was, at all these kind of fancy places, writer extraordinary, prime minister extraordinary, controversial, many, many things. It's interesting what is not written about Nehru, which is that he spent an enormous time of his life in prison. This is what's really interesting, on charges of sedition, repeatedly. I counted this once, and it's about cumulatively 9 years in prison. That's an enormous part of your life to give up, clearly for something that you must love dearly, right? So Nehru's on his final term, or what will be his final term of imprisonment. He's locked up this time in the Ahmednagar jail. If any of you haven't seen the Ahmednagar fort, which imprisoned Nehru and the Maulana, you must. It's really quite something else. So Nehru has been imprisoned yet again in the Ahmednagar jail. And this time, his imprisonment would last from August 1942 to June 1945, a little under 3 years. It's also about the time that it takes to finish a bachelor's in law. That's about 3 years. But here's what Nehru does with his 3 years in prison. His cellmate is Maulana Azad. And this is what he does with his time. He starts writing the book called The Discovery of India. And if you haven't read it, please read it. He writes this without sources. And he writes this in prison. And what are the most two challenging things in prison if you want to write a book? Anyone? Someone said paper? Very good. Anything else? Correct. Very hard. He has to battle the jailers to get paper and pen. The discovery of India ends somewhat abruptly because Nehru's jailer refuses to provide him with more paper. One of the last things the book says, and he's writing this long form on paper and then accumulating it in the cell that he's sharing with Maulana Azad. This is one of the last things Nehru writes, and you'll find this, pages 580 and 581, The Discovery of India. Penguin Books has got a new edition out. You should read it. It says this, quote, and I'm reading you this because this is the heart of the Indian Constitution and the Indian Supreme Court's conception of substantive equality. And it's written 5 years before the Constitution is adopted by a man who's now serving years, probably 6, 7, and 8 or 9 in prison, right? This is what he says. In India at any rate, quote, in India at any rate, we must aim at equality. That does not and cannot mean that everybody is physically or intellectually or spiritually equal or can be made so. But it does mean this. It means equal opportunities for all and no political, economic, or social barrier in the way of any individual or group. It means a faith in humanity and a belief that there is no race or group that cannot advance and make good in its own way given the chance to do so. It means a realization of the fact that given the backwardness or degradation of any group is not due to inherent failings in it, but principally due to lack of opportunities and long suppression by other groups. It should mean an understanding of the modern world wherein real progress and advance, whether national or international, has become very much a joint effort and a backward group pulls back others. Therefore, not only must equal opportunities be given to all, but special opportunities for educational, economic, and cultural growth must be given to backward groups so as to enable them to catch up to those who are ahead of them. Any such attempt to open the doors of opportunity to all in India will release enormous energy and ability and transform this country with dramatic speed. Unquote. And then he says, nearly 5 months have gone by since I took to this writing, and I've covered 1,000 handwritten pages with this jumble of ideas in my mind. I have almost exhausted the supply of paper that I have managed to secure after considerable difficulty, and it's not easy to get more of it. Unquote. The real way that this book should end, really, is really up to each of you. Because the real way that this book should end is not because Nehru runs out of paper. It is because we have achieved everything that the Constitution's equality conception expected us to do so. The real way the discovery of India will happen for each of us is when we are vested in our neighbor's equality, is when we refuse to vote on grounds of religion or caste or all of that stuff that we're taught in school. But here's the point. It's very real. Because the foundation of this country and the reason why this country did not end up like that other country is because that was the premise of the identity of what it was to be Indian, right? That's the real ending to Nehru's book. And now very quickly, because I'm now at 30, 40 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to take 5 minutes, just take a couple of minutes, and deal with 2 current controversial topics. Times of India loves them, and so we're going to discuss it. Appointment of judges, beef ban. Right? So, appointment of judges, right? The Constitution says this, text of judges. The Constitution says, each judge is appointed by the President of India in consultation with the Chief Justice and retires at the age of 65. So it means that the government, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, who the President really speaks for and signs off on, will appoint judges. The Supreme Court, through 3 cases, what we lawyers love to call judges' cases 1, 2, and 3, my lords. So judges' cases 1, 2, and 3 decided to give themselves the power to appoint judges. So there is a collegium existing of senior judges led by the Chief Justice who appoint Supreme Court judges in India and other judges across the country. The new bill and the new constitutional amendment, and now the new act, the National Judicial Appointments Commission Act 2014, and the 99th Amendment to the Indian Constitution, which will amend the article I read out to you, does this. The 99th Amendment to the Indian Constitution says this: there shall be a commission to be known as the National Judicial Appointments Commission, consisting of the following: the Chief Justice, 2 senior judges of the Supreme Court, the Union Law Minister, and 2 eminent persons nominated by a committee consisting of the Prime Minister, the Chief Justice, and the Leader of the Opposition in the House of People, or if there's no such Leader of the Opposition, then the Leader of the single largest opposition party. So it is this commission consisting of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people, right? The National Judicial Appointments Commission Act 2014, which the government recently bought into, it's now in the Supreme Court, and its constitutionality is being well understood and contested. This act says this: this commission, the constituents of whom we just discussed, shall recommend for appointment the senior-most judge of the Supreme Court as the Chief Justice, and this commission shall, on the basis of ability, merit, and any other criteria of suitability, recommend the name for appointment as a judge of the Supreme Court from amongst persons who are eligible to be appointed as under Clause 124(3) of the Constitution. So a rather dramatic change, going from the government appointing judges to judges appointing judges to now this commission of interesting folks appointing judges. To be fair, the National Judicial Commission model is really the model adopted in most parts of the world. This is today the most common way of appointing judges, and that is the reality of it. And by all counts, when you have an appointment process that is dominated by judges, it tends to be a strong appointment process. In the Supreme Court today, the concerns that are being addressed and argued by those contesting this bill and this constitutional amendment are threefold. One, it compromises judicial independence because it gives the executive a voice. Two, who are these eminent persons going to be? You've not defined them. So are these 2 eminent persons going to be of a certain political orientation? Or are they going to be of a different political orientation? Is it going to be an ideological appointment? Or is it going to be otherwise? And 3, of course, and one of the sort of points of argument is that we have this jurisprudence of how to appoint judges. How are you going to deal with that jurisprudence given this amendment, given this statute, and given that judicial independence is taken to be a part of the basic structure of the Indian Constitution, which many of you may know cannot be amended out. So that's kind of broadly, a sort of 2-minute version of the judicial appointment controversy as it exists, and I can take questions on it and we can sort of deal with it at that point. Parmesh, I think I may have exceeded my time. So very briefly, should we open ourselves up for questions? Finish? Okay, so very briefly on the topic of red meat. Very, very briefly, right? Beef ban. Beef, interestingly, huge issue in the Constituent Assembly. That's what's really interesting about it. Article 48 of the Constitution of India actually discusses beef and slaughter for beef, right? And it was much contested within the Assembly. So I'll read it out to you. We'll discuss it very briefly, and then I'm open for questions. Article 48 of the Constitution of India, Directive Principles of State Policy, it means that it's not enforceable in a court of law. Says this: the state shall endeavor to organize agriculture and animal husbandry on modern and scientific lines, and shall in particular take steps for preserving and improving the breeds and prohibiting the slaughter of cows and calves and other milch and draught cattle. And the understanding that the Supreme Court has of this textual language of the Constitution initially was that this would mean that you could slaughter non-reproductive cows, non-milk-giving cows. You couldn't slaughter that, but you could slaughter other cows. To cut a long story short, this eventually went up to a larger bench which said that in certain states you could have a complete ban on any kind of cow slaughter. Now, what's interesting about your act, and I'll end with this, because, Delhi people love criticizing Bombay people. So, here we go again. The Maharashtra Act number 5 of 2015, this is your beef ban statute, says this: preservation of cows, bulls, and bullocks useful for milch, breeding, draught, or agricultural purposes, and for restriction on slaughter for the preservation of certain other animals. So it's not just them, certain other animals suitable for the said purposes. And what can you not do in Mumbai? You cannot transport or even offer to transport a cow, a bull, or a bullock, which is presumably liable to be slaughtered. You cannot export or cause to be exported outside the state of Maharashtra a cow, a bull, or a bullock. And you cannot purchase, sell, or otherwise dispose of, or offer to purchase, sell, or otherwise dispose of any such cow, or bull, or bullock. And you kind of get the pattern here. This is the statute. It is fair to say that this was contested even at the founding of this country, right? And what is not in the textual language is that really this was code for religion, right? And that was part of the conversation that was had within the Constituent Assembly, where Muslim members, got up and said, what you're not talking about is that this is a religious norm. And if you're trying to get it to masquerade as an economic norm, then don't do that. Tell us that this is a religious value, and that's why you don't want to have cow slaughter. And that conversation, unfortunately, never really got resolved. Because remember, we were a consensus-oriented Constituent Assembly. And one of the things about consensus is you kind of just get things done. And you may not be tying up all the ends you need to. But it tells you this, on a more serious note, that this is not just about cows or bulls or beef or chicken, right? This is that there were challenges at that time which have not been resolved even now. And this is not just about the ban on beef, because really red meat, kind of sketchy, right, about heart issues. But on a more serious level, there were numerous constitutional challenges, social challenges that were not resolved at that time. Partition, religion, caste, meat, language. Those are the same challenges that haunt you today. Those are the same challenges you read about today. The question only is this: do we address those challenges? Do we address them within the terms of the conversation that the Constitution expects? Or do we address them in terms of the political realities that govern our societies? And those two are very different things. And that, my friends, is the challenge before contemporary India today. Thank you very much for your patience.
The Firm, India's only show on corporate law, tax and audit matters.